because we had that bibliography demo on Monday, I put up a makeup lecture, a 40-minute makeup lecture to sort of keep us on track that I asked you to play back before today's class. So this will pick up on where we left off there and will keep us moving forward so that by the end of the class we're not rushing through Impressionism as fast as we possibly can. So what we were looking at in the last couple of weeks is we were talking about the development of the Renaissance in the 15th century, the period term, right? And we were looking at this legacy called the International Gothic style, right? And how it was sort of derived from Florence and Siena, from Giotto and Duccio in the early part of the 14th century, spread throughout all of Europe, and continued to be practiced around 1500, or around 1400, that is, all over Europe. And so we were looking at the Low Countries, the Netherlands, right? Belgium and Holland these days. On the right with this work from the Walters Art Museum. And we were also looking in Italy at the legacy of the International Gothic style with the Strozzi altarpiece by Gentile da Fabriano. These are still legacies of that, with the gold background, the sort of interest in fancy brocades, right? Bright, sumptuous colors, sort of elegant figures who seem somewhat weightless, right? The dangling feet of the young magus and so forth, right? These are all elements of the International Gothic style. And what we saw then in lecture and in the online section is how moving deeper into the 15th century, both in the north, in the Low Countries, and in Italy, we move away from the International Gothic style. But we do so in a very sort of independent way each time, right? So for Van Eyck in the Netherlands, we move toward greater detail, right? Sort of exquisite, almost microscopic detail, and a sense of sort of realistic light flowing through the piece, right? And that comes from his use of oil paint. In Italy, on the left, with Masaccio, we see an interest in sort of rational space, right? The use of one-point perspective to give us a sense of, we don't have the ground tipped up anymore, taking up, 3/4 of the space. So we have not only an interest in rational space, but we also have an interest in idealized proportions, perfected proportions that came from studying ancient Roman statues, right? And that's why we call Italy at this time Renaissance, because they're really interested in ancient Rome, where Van Eyck really isn't, right? And we were looking at this one-point perspective scheme, and we were seeing that while Van Eyck has some sort of interest in, sort of has intuited this idea that things get smaller as they move back, the railroad track effect, right? He's not using a unified scheme in the same way that Masaccio is, right? So the approach to art for Van Eyck is really kind of optical in a way, whereas for Masaccio it's kind of mental. It's rational. Measurements, proportions, right? Guide Italian Renaissance art, whereas Northern art is really interested in the surface quality of things, right? The appearance of things, rather than the underlying principles, if you will, of the same things. Right? So with Masaccio's work, The Tribute Money, it's one of the, not the earliest works, but it's a good early example of this use of perspective and this use of sort of perfected body proportions. This becomes the norm in Italian art of the 15th century and continues into the 16th century, right? So it's part of why we call that the Renaissance, okay? Now, Masaccio sort of sets the stage for other artists, and here's Fra Angelico, sort of the next generation after Masaccio. Here, why don't you hand me the sheet? And if we look at Fra Angelico's work, this is another Annunciation. Goodness knows, we've seen a few, right? Another Annunciation. But it's nice because we can compare how different artists treat the same theme, right? And if we look at Fra Angelico's work, we can see that it, too, is using perspective, one-point perspective. So remember the way the one-point perspective works is that anything that's parallel to other parts, but perpendicular to the picture plane, right? Anything will converge to a single point if they're parallel lines. Okay? So there's no pen in here anymore, is there? I can't draw it on the board, so you don't have to watch me. Right? So the edge of the building here, right, ought to converge at the same point as this crossbar, this tie rod that's holding the archway together, right? And this one on this side ought to converge at the same point if he's using one-point perspective, right? Does that make sense? So everything comes together, like standing on a highway, in the Midwest. And it just goes back and eventually it looks like the highway comes to a point, right, on the horizon. And if we trace it out, we get our rulers and trace it, we find that, in fact, that's the case, right? So the tile in the floor gradually comes together. There, we trace the line out, and it hits a point in the back that's picked up by both of those side tie rods that are holding the arches together in the building. And it sort of directs our eye backward, right? So he's, again, using one-point perspective in the same way that Masaccio was doing. And this is typical of Renaissance art in Italy, beginning in the 15th century. As I mentioned in the Monday makeup lecture, this system was invented, so far as we know, right? It's very hard to find invention and being able to nail it down. But by legend, the person who came up with this was this architect named Brunelleschi, right? And he came up with the idea so that he could draw buildings properly to make presentation drawings for his clients, right? That's why he came up with it. He wanted to make more accurate, measured drawings of buildings to present his ideas to people for whom he was working. And the idea spread from him around 1415 to everyone picking up on it, right? It was eventually published in 1435 with his permission, right, by another man named Alberti in a book on how to paint called On Painting, right, Della Pittura. But it was invented by Brunelleschi, and people figured it out or got it from Brunelleschi even before that book was published. Right? Masaccio predates the book. So he knows it. He's getting it straight from the source. Right? Okay. One of the things that we see when you're choosing a vanishing point is it doesn't have to be the dead center of the composition. It could be anywhere on the composition you want, as long as it's on the horizon line. Right? Off to the left, off to the right. And what it ends up doing is sort of directing your eye subconsciously to that point, right? And we saw with Masaccio's tribute money that the vanishing point is Christ's head. And it ends up directing our eye to Christ, who's right in the center as well. But you'll notice with Angelico, where's the vanishing point? It's that window in the background. Bingo, right? Remember windows in the Annunciation, how important that is as a metaphor? Light passes through glass and leaves the Virgin intact, right? In the same way that glass is left intact if it's clean and light passes through it. And the light of God, therefore, passes into this pure vessel that is the Virgin Mary. And it's a metaphor we saw Van Eyck using, and we saw Robert Campan using it when we looked at Northern European art. And here, Angelico is using it as well, because the perspective points our eye back toward her little room back there where the window is on the wall. Right? Now, this is a fresco painting, and you can see parts of it have been damaged. It looks like the dove of the Holy Spirit was originally painted on top of the fresco and is now missing, right? Worn off over time. Kind of like the blue in Giotto's Arena Chapel that flake off, right? When they're not done in pure, true fresco, a buon fresco, they tend to sort of flake off the wall, whereas buon fresco ends up being very, very sort of resilient, right? Okay, so this is a metaphor. It's not chock-a-block full of little details like a Van Eyck is, or Robert Campan for that matter, where every little thing seems to point to another element of symbolism. But the stuff that is here is symbolic, right? So not only do we have the pure window as a symbol for the Virgin Mary, but we also have a very, very clean room. And some people have suggested that this idea of her cell in the background, her little room, which is utterly clean and empty, might also be a symbol for the Virgin Mary, the room that's about to be filled with Christ at this particular moment, if you will. And if we look at the rest of the composition off to the left, we see the angels coming into this little loggia, right, this little patio, covered patio. And behind the angel, we have a fence. And we see this flowered garden on this side of the fence. It's well kept, right, tended. And on the outside, we see sort of the wilds, forest. And this relates to another very well-known metaphor for the Virgin Mary, that the Virgin was an enclosed garden, right? And we find that throughout devotional literature, right, religious literature from this period and even earlier. So Fra Angelico is including these elements to add to the symbolism, right? The enclosed garden, the clean room, the light through the window. Whereas Van Eyck would have done this through these realized details of the building, right, that are pretty much everywhere. The floor, the ceiling, the windows, the walls, right, everything added into that. Camping, right, we've got the dish in the background, and we got the lilies growing out of the pot, right? Joseph making mouse traps. There's just again and again these things pick up, right? And for Fra Angelico, it's kind of simplified, but still deeply symbolic, right? Now, his name, Fra Angelico, right? That's a nickname he picked up. Fra means brother. Comes from fraternity, right? Fra means brother. So he's a monk, okay? And monks, when they took their monastic orders, would usually change their name, right? And his name was, I believe, Julio. But he picked up the name Angelico because his figures are so angelic looking. And that became sort of his nickname, right? The angelic monk, Fra Angelico, because of the quality of his paintings, this sort of doll-like, porcelain-like quality of his figures that we see in the Virgin Mary with her slender fingers and her incredibly pale, fine skin. Right? These are elements of Fra Angelico's work. Now, Fra Angelico lived at a monastery in Florence, the monastery of San Marco. It's a Dominican monastery. So he's one of these mendicant orders that we talked about the first day of class, right? The mendicants. The monks who had moved back into the city to preach to city folk rather than living out in the countryside, which had been the norm for about 1,000 years. Right? So he's a Dominican monk living at the monastery of San Marco, and this fresco is in the monastery. Right? He's painting his own home, if you will. Right? They've hired him to do this. Yeah.
So how common was it to have somebody like in-house?
Rare. Right? But the thing is, it's nice. I mean, lucky him. Yeah? To have somebody in-house. Fra Angelico is rare in that we have, I'm trying to think now, if I just sort of throw my mind out there, that's my mental net, right? Fra Angelico is, I think about 4 artists from this period who are also belong to a particular monastery, right? We'll see a second one last, but if we were to sort of do a broader survey, there's a couple more out of dozens and dozens and dozens. So it's not extraordinarily rare, but it's also not common, right, for them to be in-house. Now, the idea of an in-house artist, right, is itself kind of an interesting thing. So we think about Jan van Eyck, right? He had the job, and I think we mentioned this, is he was court painter to Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy, right? That made him a sort of in-house artist. Now, he had a bit more leeway, but most court artists actually live at court, right? Part of being a court artist is that you get residence, which is kind of cool because, you know, paid rent at a palace, no less, right? So it's not a bad thing to be the in-house artist, right? We talked about Roger van der Weyden being the official city painter to the city of Brussels. It's kind of the similar idea of being an in-house artist, right? In those cases, because you get them first grab, right? So it's a good gig when you can get it. Leonardo da Vinci became the in-house artist to the Duke of Milan, and then which is why the Mona Lisa is in Paris, right? Is because he became a court painter in France. So that concept of being the in-house painter is broader, but whether or not you're a monk and painting as well is less common in the Renaissance, but much more common in the Middle Ages, right? Because most of our works that we have in them, particularly manuscripts, painted manuscripts, up until around the 13th century, those were made in monasteries. And it was only in the 1200s in Paris that we started to get professional artists painting books, right? So the Limburg brothers were professional artists painting books, but they were, again, house artists, right? To Jean de Berry, okay? They're the new order, if you will, right? The old order would have been that monks painted books, right? And so from our earliest illustrated manuscripts, like 6th century AD, all the way through to around 1100, 1200, artists are monks, right? In Europe, okay? And I'm really going to talk about Europe, okay? So that's a longish answer, but it's an important thing because what we're seeing with Angelico is sort of a legacy of an older tradition, right? The monk as artist. In an era when artists are now independent craftsmen, right? Making their place in society through the quality of their work and the money that they make, like any other craftsman in the Renaissance, and being appreciated specifically for that. So he's the house artist, if you will, at the monastery of San Marco, right? He lives there and he's painting the monastery at the behest of the abbot, right? The head of the monastery. He's not just going out and graffitiing, you know? And this one here is this is the cloister. We talked about cloisters before. That leads to the different cells. Each monk would have their own little room, and the little room looks an awful lot like the Virgin's little room in the background. And you can see that the architecture of Angelico's Annunciation looks an awful lot like the architecture of the monastery. Right? It fits in. This is the monastery of San Marco on your left. Some of the frescoes that you see here are not for Angelico's, they're later. But he did make frescoes in each of the monks' cells in the monastery. Right? So there are multiple ones. There's now a museum. If you ever go to Florence, you can go visit this, right? And this particular picture, the mural on your right, the fresco of the Annunciation, is at the entrance to the cloister. So the monks would have walked by it every single day. And there's a couple of inscriptions along the bottom. There's one in letters above the tiling, kind of hanging there between the columns, and another one on the edge, the lip of the floor that's inscribed. And it basically says, don't forget to say Hail Mary as you pass in front of this. Right? So the point of the work is to inspire devotion, right? It's not a work made specifically to show off his talent, right? The idea is to get you to sort of think about the Virgin Mary and direct your thoughts and ideas. Yeah. Yeah, and this is significant. This is the first one without it. This is part of what is interesting about this work is the degree to which he simplifies a lot of the traditions. So there's no lilies, right? Or laurel branches. The angel's always been coming in. There's always been a flower involved, it seems. And the book, yeah, you're right. She's got absolutely no book. But what it is, of course, and there's also this obeisance. She's really into this sort of like, there's none of this, right, scare or thinking it through. Like she is totally, I am a servant. I'll do what you say. It's spot on that. And he's pared down all the other details so that what's left is what we focus on, right? Kind of like with Roger van der Weyden in that deposition, right? The lowering from the cross where it looks like it's in a box and there's nothing to get in the way of us seeing all these crying people, right? And in this case, he wants us to really just focus on that moment, right? And what's left still has symbolism, right? But it's just what's left over, right? And even though it's simplified, it's pulled this up. Somebody mentioned it appears she's sitting on a stool with 3 legs and trying to read into that Trinity, right? The 3 windows behind Van Eyck. I think that's a bit of a stretch. You know, so sometimes it is what it is, right? Freud says sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right? Not everything has to be symbolic if it's legitimately realistic, right? One of the things that is interesting about this, insofar as what's left and the symbolism, is that you'll notice that the arches in the foreground are round and the arches in the background are pointed. So it's not consistent, the architecture isn't, whereas the building itself is round, right? So Fra Angelico seems to be making a distinction between two styles of architecture. And in Italy in the 15th century, the round style was new. Right? That was the revival of old Roman styles, and it's the Renaissance style of architecture, is rounded arches. And the older style is pointed, Gothic. Right? And this idea of going from old to new might also be symbolic. Because what's happening at the Annunciation is the old covenant, the old way to salvation, Judaism, is being replaced by Christian theology, in Christian theology, is being replaced by the new covenant, the new agreement, which is salvation through Christ's sacrifice. Right? And that idea of new replacing old might well be behind Angelico making the building different from what the building actually looks like in the background. Right? That is built in two different styles, one old, one new. And if we think about that, and we think about Van Eyck's Annunciation, we had this building that was broken and needed to be fixed. That's old to new, right? In very much the same way. So interesting ideas that are played out differently by different artists, right? So good question about the book, right? That it's not there. Well, Angelico also was called upon to paint other works for the monastery. As I mentioned, he did frescoes in the monks' individual rooms and their cells, connected by that cloister. He was also asked by the monastery to paint the altar for the chapel, right? The altarpiece. And it survives, although it's kind of a wreck, right? And we see a number of saints, particularly Dominicans on the right, but various saints gathering around the Virgin Mary on the throne. So this is very much like Duccio's old Maesta altar, right? It's saints of various time periods gathering around the Virgin Mary, Christ on her lap. You can see in the background there's that same idea of separating her from the forest outside. And I love the interest in sort of natural sky settings, right? The sort of sunset behind her. And the saints are sort of talking to each other as they're gathered around, and two of them very prominently kneeling in the foreground, right? But we can identify most of them, and then there's some angels as well. Again, for a 15th century Italian piece, it again relies very much on perspective, right? The entire space is organized by this rational one-point perspective that you'll notice points us right to the heart of the Virgin Mary, if I'm drawing this correctly. And this all depends on my accuracy with PowerPoint, right? But it looks like it stabilizes the composition. It's symmetrical. It gives it this sort of, triangle sort of composition. But it does lead us directly to the Virgin Mary. And I would have to trace this out more directly to see if it's meant to be the heart of the Virgin Mary as well. Just like our statue out here where she's pointing to her heart, right, in front of the chapel. Okay? Now the saints in the foreground. They are Saints Cosmas and Damian. And we know this because their halos have their name on them. Cosmas and Damian. And Cosmas and Damian were brothers who were doctors. Right around the early part of the 4th century. Right? So 1,000 years old. Cosmas and Damian. And Cosmas looks out at us, and Damian looks in. And in this book on painting that had the perspective scheme in it, one of the things that Alberti tells painters is a good way to engage your audience is to put people on either side and have one look out and the other one look in, right? And that's exactly what Fra Angelico is doing here, right? One engages us, the other engages with what's in the picture, right? Translating our experience in. Now, Cosmas and Damian are given this position of prominence because of who paid for this. I said that commission was given by the abbot of the monastery, but the money for it was donated by the famous Medici family, Cosimo de' Medici. Now, you may have heard of them. They show up on TV shows. Netflix has got you can stream a British TV series on them. There was something on PBS that called them the Godfathers of the Renaissance. Cosimo de' Medici was the most powerful man in Florence in the 15th century. And he came from a lineage of doctors. Look at the name Medici, right? Medicine, right? But by the 15th century, the family had transferred from being this legacy of coming from doctors to being bankers. So they're a lot like Enrico Scrovegni, Giotto's patron, right? How do bankers make money? Interest, right, is their thing, right? They fund people and they get paid back from the money that they loan, right? And Cosimo's family is accrued a significant amount of wealth through banking, right? And because he pays for it, he gets the family patron saints front and center. Cosmas and Damian are the Medici family patron saints, and the names of Medici's children are usually drawn from Cosmas and Damian. So Cosimo is Cosmas. And if we look at it, that's actually his portrait. That's Cosimo de' Medici in the guise of Saint Cosmas, looking directly at us. Right? He paid for it. He paid for the monastery. He paid for the entire freaking building. Right? The architect who built it was his house architect, the one who designed his palace as well. Right? This is a Medici institution. And the idea that Cosimo would pay for all of this is not any different from Duke Philip the Bold getting the monastery of Champmont with Klaus Schluter and all of that, right? So that you get the monks that pray for you, right? On a daily basis. And in addition to that, Cosimo got one of the cells next to the monks with a separate sort of side private entrance as well. And it was twice as big as all the other ones. Right? It was a McMansion of monastery cells. Right? So here's Cosimo's portrait. We have a little portrait medallion of him. This is in the National Gallery, actually. This little medallion is about this big. Right? And his portrait appears here. His brother was named Damien, and he had just died. And we think that's why Damien's back is turned as well. Right? Is Damiano, Cosimo's brother, had died. Right? So there's references to Medici family saints are given extraordinary prominence in the altarpiece, right? Because of the money that he spent on this, right? Now, as an Italian altarpiece, it originally had a predella. Remember this term for predellas? They were the scenes that appeared along the bottom, right, of the work. And the norm for a predella, and we've seen this already before, is that it gives us narrative scenes that relate to the saints who are up above. Right? So the main body of the altarpiece in Italian works tends not to tell the story. It's just the Virgin in heaven with saints. Right? And the predella down below will tell us the story. And in this case, what the predella has are 8 scenes from the life of St. Cosmas and Damian. It's going to tell us their story, right? And so there are 8 of those scenes, and in the middle is an image of Jesus being put in the tomb, right? But around that, 8 scenes of Cosmas and Damian. And probably this was 3-dimensional, right? So originally, it would have come out from the wall with some sort of architecture around it. And the scenes on the sides would have probably faced this way, right out, left and right. So you would have had on the front of it the 7 center scenes, and the 2 on the sides, which is slightly smaller, would have been this way, right? Well, we've got one of them down at the National Gallery, right? So when we think about these works that we have locally, we've got part of the predella from the San Marco altarpiece that you can go see. And it's the first one in the series, again, sort of around the corner on the right, and it sets off the story, telling us the story of Cosmas and Damian. Now, like I said, around 4th century, they're doctors. And they're the patron saints of the Medici family who began their rise to prominence as doctors, but are now bankers. And the idea of doctors and money are wrapped up in the story of Cosmas and Damian. Right? So in this case, this woman, Palladia, had gotten horribly sick. That's her on the left, right? And she went to every doctor out there, and nobody could cure her. So she finally calls up Cosmas and Damian because she's heard that Cosmas and Damian have been blessed by God with the ability to heal miraculously. Right? Best possible doctor. Right? They don't cure anything because they can work miracles through, or God works miracles through them. Right? So after trying all the normal medicine, she goes for a little alternative health care. Right? Getting miraculous healing. She's going to give this a shot. And so what we see in the room is the sick Palladia with her servants behind her. Notice it's still kind of rendered in perspective. If we traced it out, we could do that. And there's Cosmas and Damian ministering to her. Now, when they received this gift from God, right, the ability to heal miraculously, they understood that they could do this, they decided it would be wrong to take money because it's not them doing it, right? I can't get paid for this. It's God, not me. So they had this agreement that they would go out and they would heal people, but they would refuse payment. Simply because it would be wrong to be paid for God working miracles through you. You should be more humble than that, right? So we see them here, and they've got this sort of agreement between them. They're not going to get paid. And you'll notice they're dressed exactly the same. We can tell they're brothers, right? And we see a second scene outside, right? Where one of the servants of Palladia is going to Cosmas, right? And insisting that he take money. And he's going, no, no, no. Yes, 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 no. And he finally decides, I'll take it because it would be rude not to. Right? That idea of receiving a gift you don't want because it's rude if you say no. Right? You've seen this in like mafia movies. Right? You've got to take the gift. So, okay, fine, I will. And Damian finds out about this, and he gets really pissed off, right? You are no longer my brother, right? And I refuse to even be buried next to you. He's so mad that Cosmas took this money. So this starts off that whole story, right? And as the story plays out, we see various rulers try to kill the two of them for their faith. Never works, right? Throws them into the ocean spits them back out. Ties them up and has archers shoot them full of arrows, and the arrows bounce off and kill all the archers. On and on it goes until he finally has their heads cut off. But right before they're finally martyred, they reconcile. Right? Damian figures out that it was a good thing, and they're buried together. Right? That's kind of how it all wraps up. And if we had more time, we'd go through all 8 because they're really fun, right? Images. But for Cosimo de' Medici, this is 2 ways important. One, medicine, right? The legacy of the family's prominence. Medici medicine. The other is, it's okay to get money, right? Even as a saint, it's okay to get money. And as Cosimo, a banker, this is a crucial image, right? You can still be a saint and receive payment. Right? So this really is a scene that we think is orchestrated to fit with what Cosimo wants from the image. Because remember, for painters in the Renaissance, they're not making things on spec, right? They don't make things unless the patron pays for them. And you want to please the person who's writing the check, right? And that's the case with this particular image. Okay. Another monk active in the 15th century, I said that I could think of 4 or so. Fra Filippo Lippi. So he's also a member of a monastery. He didn't proactively join. Okay? Fra Angelico had begun as an artist and decided to take monastic vows, and that's why he joined a monastery. He said, I am going to devote my life to God. Fra Filippo Lippi was born an orphan. And monasteries often functioned as charitable institutions. So on some levels, the monasteries are in the countryside, right, would house travelers. They still do to this day, right, as a charitable institution. And they would also, monasteries would take in orphaned boys just as convents would take in orphaned women, right, as part of their charitable institution. So Fra Filippo Lippi becomes a monk from birth because he's orphaned. So it's not an active choice on his part. And we've got a lot of information on all of these artists because of somebody I've mentioned a couple times. There's this guy named Giorgio Vasari, who was a pupil of Michelangelo, the famous sculptor, painter Michelangelo, in the 1560s, right, 100 years later, writes a book on Renaissance art, right? Often talked about as being sort of the first prominent art historian, right? And he writes a history of the Renaissance, and it's called The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. And he is the source of all sorts of information that you've heard already in this class, going all the way back to Giotto, who he says is the beginning of it all, right? He writes this, how did we get here, right? That's the whole point of his book. The Lives of the Artists is going to lead us from the beginnings of the Renaissance to Michelangelo. That's kind of, and he treats it as this linear ascent to greatness, right? And he basically says, hey, it starts with Giotto, right? He lives in Florence, so he knows Giotto's stuff really well, right? He doesn't visit Siena so much, so he doesn't know as much about Duccio, right? Never goes to Venice, a little about that, right? But it's all leading up to Michelangelo. And in fact, the biographies of the early artists are pretty short, say 5 pages. Michelangelo's is like 50 pages, right? Because he knows a lot about him. He's done research, and he's looked at the works, and he's figured... Anyway, he gives us a ton of information about these different artists that are working in Florence, right? And he tells us about Fra Filippo Lippi. It's a great little biography because it's full of really juicy, salacious details. Because it turns out that whereas Fra Angelico chose to be a monk and is really suited to the task, Fra Filippo Lippi was not. Right? Because again, being a monk was not his choice. Right? And Vasari tells us details about his life. He was twice arrested for embezzlement. Right? Taking money that wasn't his, grafting. He was sent off to paint frescoes at a convent in northern Italy, away from Florence. And while there, he impregnated one of the nuns. Yeah, right? This led the church to strip him of his title. Done with it. Get out of here, right? You're going out knocking up nuns. You're not going to be a monk anymore, right? You're out. You're on the streets. And he continued after that to sign paintings with Fra Filippo Lippi and refer to himself as Fra, even though he's no longer a Fra, right? No longer a brother in the monastery. And he also tells us that Lippi also worked for Cosimo de' Medici regularly. And there's a lot of evidence that supports this, right, that he did. And in fact, there is, in the Medici Palace in Florence, there's a Fra Filippo Lippi that looks an awful lot like ours, right? And this one was made for Cosimo. And the other thing that Vasari tells us about Lippi is that he was so prone to living la vida loca or whatever, right? That he's so prone to partying that Cosimo had to lock him up in the palace in order to get him to finish his work, right? Sounds like your mom. You don't get to go play until you do your homework, right? That's a 40-year-old memory for me, yeah? So Cosimo Lippi worked for him, okay, regularly. but he was not the house artist that we were talking about before that way, right? But rather he was just a common patron. And in addition to this small work that's similar to ours, that's in the Medici Palace in Florence, he also painted a chapel for them, right? The wall behind the altar in the chapel for the Medici family as well. Okay? Now, our work, I think, is a better painting than this, or at least as good as, right? And was not made for the Medici, but we can see that what Fra Filippo Lippi is doing is he's making different variations of the same composition for different people, right? He probably has a model that he keeps in the studio, and people would come to visit him to buy a work, and they would say, oh, I want something like that, but could you do this with it? Could you change that to this? You know, could you personalize it for me by switching these things around? And so with Lippi, we've got 4 or 5 of this kind of Madonna and Child, where they're seen kind of behind a table, right, with Jesus on the table, looking very much like an altar almost, right, this marble slab that Christ sits on, like the communion, the body of Christ sits on an altar in the church. But these were meant for private use, right, meant for devotion at home. They are not church altar pieces. So lots of similarities between the two, stylistic similarities as well, right? The face of the Virgin Mary looks very similar in both of them. Jesus doing different things, but both of them, he's kind of squirmy, and it's a good little baby Jesus, right? It's like the best baby we've seen so far, right? He doesn't look like a little man, right? Like Giotto's with male pattern baldness, you know? He looks like an angelic little blonde kid, right? And he's doing kid-like things, hugging mom on the right as he sort of staggers around the altar, looking like he's about to burp up, you know, in our picture in the National Gallery, right? Notice also that both of them have included her in this niche. She sort of sits in front of a rounded stone architectural detail, right? A niche, sort of, that's what we call that, right? And the dome, the half dome, over the top of that niche is the same in both of them. What does that look like? It's shell, right? It looks like a conch shell. And that's a kind of fascinating thing about these. And it's something we see for the Virgin Mary as a long-standing symbol of the Virgin Mary. I can think of examples back to the middle of the 5th century, right? Of images of the Virgin Mary associating her with the conch shell, right? And so it's a long-standing tradition. It's a 1,000-year-old tradition by Lippi's time of the conch shell as a symbol of the Virgin Mary. And here's a nice close-up of it, right? And so the question would come up, what's up with the conch shell, right? And what a conch shell does, obviously, is it associates the Virgin Mary with the sea, right? That's shells come from the sea. So what's the connection between the Virgin Mary and the ocean? And
In other languages, don't they refer to like mermaids as
as
virgins?
I'm sorry, I missed.
They like
Refer-
in other languages, the word mermaid is
Ah.
like virgin.
Mermaid is maiden of the sea, right? Mer is the word for ocean, right? And so Mary, right, is part of that. And in fact, the Hebrew name for Mary is Miriam, right? And Miriam means, in Hebrew, a drop of the sea, right? So there's that connection there already, right, with the drop of the sea, right? Now, when that word, Miriam, was translated, drop of the sea, was translated into Latin church, right? It became Stilla Maris, drop of the sea. And that got morphed over time to Stella Maris, the star of the sea, right? So Mary's associated in a number of different ways with the ocean, droplet of the sea, but also later the star of the sea, okay? And the star of the sea became important for Christians because what does the star of the sea do? It guides sailors to the safe port, to the safe harbor. And the Virgin Mary becomes this safe harbor, right? All of these things get wrapped up in the image. So the conch shell here drives home this idea that she is our safe harbor, right? And the fact that it's a niche in front of a stone slab makes it look like an altar. You know, the destiny or the destination of our journey, spiritual journey, right? Is toward the altar. And there she is, our safe harbor, right? And if we look at the image more closely, you'll notice something, that there's a star on her lapel. And if we go back and look at other images of the Virgin Mary we've seen, this is really common. That there's a star right there, and it goes back to this idea of Stella Maris, right? The star of the sea, which derived from the idea of the droplet of the sea. So, Fra Filippo Lippi, right there, and here, Stella Maris, right? Easy to remember with beer ads these days, right? Doesn't the dude drink? Now we know that the dude, Lebowski, drinks Stella for the Super Bowl commercial. So there she is, the star of the sea, right? And the conch shell adds to that metaphor. Okay? So, again, details are chosen by the artist with very specific ideas in mind. And usually these ideas are trying to add to the meaning, right? Now, when we think about the conch shell, excuse me, as a reference point to the ocean, for anybody in the Renaissance, thinking back about reviving ancient Greece and Rome, the idea of a conch shell in the ocean would have brought up other associations as well, beyond simply the star of the sea, right? Does anybody know Greek mythology at all? Anything? You seen this picture before? Sorry. Seen this before? Venus, according to Greek mythology, was born of the ocean, right? It's kind of a disgusting story. The god Uranus had his testicles cut off, and they got thrown into the ocean, and this gave birth to Venus, right? And that she was then washed ashore on a conch shell, right? That was then blown to shore. So the famous Botticelli piece, which is, by the way, also done for the Medici family, we'll talk about it later, shows Venus, the birth of Venus, right? This miraculous birth of Venus. Now, for Christians, this made a nifty metaphor, right? Because the Virgin Mary, according to the theology of Immaculate Conception, was herself sort of miraculously born. She was also associated with the sea. She's also associated with love, right? Venus is the goddess of love. The Virgin Mary brings love to mankind, right? Spiritual love. So there's a number of associations between these things, and we know from Renaissance writings that this idea of connecting Christianity to other religions, particularly to pagan mythology, was a very, very common sort of mind game that people would play, right? And the Medici were deeply involved with that, as well others were at the time, right? So our conch shell here gives us multiple symbolisms, right? It's multivalent. It speaks many voices and tells us many different things about the Virgin Mary. Right? So if we go back to even when we think about Fra Angelico, how simple that Annunciation was, yet the things that are there are important. Right? And if everything is important, then what's going on with Jesus? This is really great because, okay, he's grabbing her finger again, right? And we've seen that before. We saw that with Giotto, right? That cute little baby grabs finger thing, you know? And in this case, it's not her index finger anymore, but he's grabbing her ring finger, right? And it seems to suggest marriage on a certain level. Now, they're not married by any means, right? But the Virgin Mary is associated with the church. We talked about that with Van Eyck, right? She is the church. Think of Notre Dame, Our Lady, the church, right? And the church is the bride of Christ, according to Christian theology. So, spiritually, she's the bride of Christ, right? And touching her ring finger, right? So, that, I think, is an important element. And what does she touch? Is that right? Sorry? Part of it, but her finger, her thumb, her forefinger right here, underneath his chin. And it kind of could be a, cute little Gucci goo sort of thing, right? Tickling him. But what's right there? What do we have there? Adam's apple, right? Now just think about that. She's touching the apple. by medieval legend, right, men have the Adam's apple because when Adam ate the apple, it stuck, right? And that was legend, but it's medieval legend, right? And that was the sign of original sin, right, with the Adam's apple. Now, with that in mind, we can find a number of writings throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance that talk about Christ as the new Adam. That Adam, right, was made by God, sent to earth, miraculously fabricated by God, on earth, brought sin to mankind. Jesus, miraculously made by God, brought to earth to relieve that sin. Right? What Adam did, Christ undoes. Right? And so Christ is often referred to as the new Adam, in the same way that the Virgin Mary is sometimes referred to as the new Eve. Because each of them undoes what the original people did. Right? And I think Philippa Lippi is also making reference to that by having her indicate his Adam's apple. Right? She could be grabbing him anywhere. And he's made him grab him in a very particular place. Right? So I think this alludes again to symbolism within the picture, ways in which to read it, that Christ is indeed the new Adam. Another Madonna and Child from the National Gallery. Sandro Botticelli, he's the artist of our Birth of Venus that we just saw, actually studied under Filippo Lippi. He was a pupil. Right? Remember, the ways that you learned art during the Renaissance was that you apprenticed. You didn't go to art school. You didn't major in art. You apprenticed under a working artist. And Sandro Botticelli apprenticed under Filippo Lippi, was his first teacher. And there are certain similarities that we can see between these two pictures. It's even closer to another Filippo Lippi, which I'll show you in just a second. But you'll notice the conch shells there again. There's that convention of associating the Virgin Mary, right, with the ocean. And in this case, Jesus is doing something different. She's holding him, looking down at him. He's being sort of raised up by these two angels toward her. There's a close-up of the conch shell decorating the apse. Also notice the interest in perspective still. Even though it's a very small amount of architectural detail, we have the exact same interest in one-point perspective that we could trace out. And in fact, with this particular painting, you can see the tracing lines of the perspective as he sort of scratched them into the surface before he started painting the work. And I think it's on the Filippo Lippi even as well. Very, very close to another work by Filippo Lippi. So close that some people have even argued over whether or not some Botticellis might be by Lippi or some Lippis might be by Botticelli. And these are extraordinarily close. Again, two angels lifting up Christ into the arms of his mother. Instead of praying to him, she's now taking him from the hands of the angels, but still seated on a chair that we see the arm of in the lower left corner, right? But replacing now that window onto a landscape with the conch shell background, right? And a wall behind her as well for that idea of the enclosed garden, right? Picking up different metaphors that we talked about before. Now, Botticelli's work was made for the Medici, and we know this because that's the Medici coat of arms. Those 6, right? Golden half balls in a circular field. That's the Medici coat of arms. So this is a Medici work. This is something that they originally owned and would have been seen in conjunction with that other Filippo Lippi that we saw. Right? Now has come down to the National Gallery through various collectors through time. Right? So it's important with these works to remember that patronage is driving these. And I want to reiterate with a lot of these how important the Medici family is as one of the determining factors in the Renaissance. The Medici are important patrons. They love art, and for 3 generations, right? Beginning with Cosimo, then his son Piero, then his grandson Lorenzo. All of them are extraordinary patrons of the arts, buying and commissioning major works. And arguably, the 15th century part of the Renaissance would not have happened if it weren't for the Medici family. They're the money behind a significant amount of it. Okay. So again, there's Cosimo. He's probably the one for whom this was made, or maybe for his son Piero. Right? Cosimo dies in 1464. So it depends on where we date this work as to whether or not Cosimo paid for it or his son Piero paid for it. Right? The National Gallery is lucky because we got a lot of works from the Medici family. Right? This adoration of the Magi, begun by Fra Angelico around 1440 and finished by Fra Filippo Lippi. Both of those artists worked for the Medici. We saw that already. Right? This was also in the inventory of works that they owned. So this is a Medici work. And you'll notice it's different from every painting that we've seen so far because it's round. Right? A round frame picture. And these are not uncommon. We see these in the Renaissance quite often. And whenever we see a round frame picture, we know that the picture was a gift. And in fact, the Italian term for it is a tondo, right? And it comes to an older tradition being updated in the Renaissance. It was the norm in Italy when the child was born that you would present a gift. And usually one of the most common gifts amongst aristocrats was a silver plate. It was a normal gift at the birth of a child. And as we move into the 15th century, we start to see that silver plate being replaced with something equally valuable, equally wonderful, a round painting that reflected the tradition, but has now been updated to a work of art that we call a wall. This is huge, right? This is about 4 feet. It's very, very large. So it's an extraordinary gift, right? And the subject matter that's chosen for it is relevant, right? The birth of a child to a family. What better gift than an image of the birth of Christ, right? Then the owner of the painting begins to associate their son, daughter, with Jesus. Right? So the subject matter is related to its original use as a birth gift. Now, the interesting thing about this being in the Medici collection is that it has similarities to this work. And I want to point to it. Right? There's a lot of similarities. I've got a detail, but this guy right here, I've never seen this written anywhere, by the way. Maybe we should write this up. There's a weird sort of parallelism. Why was that figure reappearing in both of these images? Well, it turns out that Strozzi, right? We talked about Strozzi, a very wealthy man in the 20s, 1420s, right? Was his family were the enemies of the Medici family. Right? They were rising in power in the 1420s. And the Medici, the way they controlled Florence was they worked behind the scenes. Because Florence prided themselves on being a democracy. Right? They were a republic. And so leaders, they didn't have kings, they didn't have dukes, right? They didn't have inherited power. They had elected power, right? It was the will of the people. And in order to hold office, you needed to belong to one of the trade guilds. You know? And the Medici never held elected power, right? They were able to get their people elected. Right? They were the Koch brothers, right? Or George Soros, right? They worked behind the scenes to get their agenda fulfilled by getting people that they wanted elected to different positions. But unlike the Koch brothers or Soros, they were much more puppet masters, right? And really recognized those people, they're really the ones who are in charge, right? Thus, the godfathers of the Renaissance, right? Okay. This was known by people, recognized, and challenged often, especially when the Medici family got too much power. And in the early 1430s, right, Paolo Strozzi, the enemy of the Medici family, is able to get Cosimo de' Medici exiled from Florence. Because he said, and he convinced people that Cosimo was violating working behind the scenes. So he's getting kicked out of Florence. And it works. 1433, Cosimo is kicked out of Florence, but he's able, because he's so powerful, to play the system and come back within a year. Right? He's back in Florence by 1434. Okay? When Cosimo comes back, he gets revenge. And he gets Paolo Strozzi kicked out of Florence forever, for the rest of his life, in 1434. And when that happens, Cosimo usurps the entire Strozzi art collection. It becomes Medici. So the Strozzi altarpiece, which was made when Paolo Strozzi was in power, after 1434 becomes part of the Medici collection. So when Fra Angelico starts this, and certainly when Fra Filippo Lippi finishes it, the Strozzi altarpiece belongs to the Medici family. And this would account for, I think, why our Adoration of the Magi borrows certain elements from it. Now, some of the things that are in common in both of these, we can explain because they've got to be there. You've got to have the Magi. He's going to kneel in front of Christ. He's going to kiss his foot. That's traditional. That's conventional. That's not explained by this. That's going to happen anyway. But what's there insofar as other details are a little bit harder to explain because they're sort of special in the Strozzi altarpiece and are picked up in the Medici Tondo on your right. So I wanted to look at a couple of those details. Right? So the guy looking up into the sky is so similar in both of these, the placement of that figure, and he's not in every single Adoration of the Magi scene, right? And yet he's here. What's he doing here? I think he's there in red to remind us of the source for many of the details and to remind us that this work relates to works that are already owned by the Medici and are symbols of their power at the time. The guy on the left is looking at those fighting birds, and that motif appears as well, with the two birds fighting on top of the shed, right? Are here as well. The angry horses that we saw in the Strozzi altarpiece are here as well. The naked guys are a bit of a conversation point. We're not 100% sure what they're doing back there, but they're standing on a broken wall. And that idea of a broken wall is a theme that we've already seen. Old giving way to new, right? Christ's birth brings in a new phase of salvation, and it has to come in by Christian theology because the old ways are broken. So this broken city gate seems to be a reference to outmoded modes of salvation. And the naked figures might also relate to not being sort of covered, if you will, by the new form of salvation, this new Christianity. But the horses in the foreground, I think, also a reference to the Strozzi altarpiece. Finally, our lead magus is kneeling in front of the Virgin Mary. Again, we can pick out, all of them. We can move our way back. Right? And again, we get the three ages of man related through the three different ages of the Magi, and the eldest one kneeling down, and again, taking the body of Christ and putting it in his mouth. Right? He's not eating Jesus. He's kissing him. But it relates to the idea that we take the body of Jesus to our mouths during the Mass ceremony. Even though this was not used as part of the Mass ceremony, it makes us remember right? The importance of that for that sacrament for our salvation. You'll also notice that behind the Virgin Mary, he also includes one of our shepherds that we've seen before. So he's sort of bringing together multiple scenes, not just the Magi, but also the adoration of the shepherds, or their nativity scene. You see this ripped clothing here, our shepherd coming in from the right-hand side. So for most of today's class, we've been talking a lot about the Medici family, right, as patrons of the arts. And as we look at Florence in the 15th century, what we find is that they're not the only ones out there buying art, but they're a very, very prominent example of what makes the Renaissance, which is this new class of people that didn't exist through the Middle Ages, who are using their newfound open capitalist money to support religious works, both for their own use and also for public use. And the Medici family are a keen part of that. Now, they're also supporting other works of art simply for themselves, right? So another work of art that was done for Cosimo de' Medici is the famous David by Donatello. If you've done worksheet number 4, right, on Or San Michele, right, we've encountered Donatello, right? Right, so he did these 2 different statues on, or he actually did 3, on the church of, or the Guild Meeting Hall of Or San Michele in Florence, and there's a worksheet on this. And from this, he had become easily the most in-demand sculptor, not only in Florence, but in all of Italy, right? He is to 15th century sculpture what Michelangelo would become to 16th century sculpture. He's the one you want, right? And had made his fame already by the time the Medici are hiring him. Right? So he gives us here an image of David from the Old Testament having slain Goliath. He has the rock from the sling in his hand, carries the sword in the other hand, and he's standing on top of Goliath's head. Right? And originally, this was placed in the courtyard of the Medici Palace. Right? So as you came in off the street behind that other statue, he would have been right in the middle of this open air area. Right? So prominent placement and seen by any visitor to the Medici Palace. Right? Donatello has borrowed again from ancient Roman statues. This is that Renaissance. So when we're talking about the Renaissance, there are these phases of the Renaissance, right? Early on, Giotto just realism. That's kind of all he's into, right? When he's looking back at old Roman art, he likes chiaroscuro, 3-dimensional qualities. Right? With the 15th century, when they're looking back at Roman art, we're starting to get Roman body types, Roman poses. Right? 3-dimensionality is still there, definitely, but they're adding to it by looking sort of more deeply at Roman art and picking up other things. Roman figures translated into the modern world. And the contrapposto that David has, that's where the weight is resting on one leg, right? The other leg is relaxed, where one arm is more flexed than the other. Counterpoised balance. Donatello is getting from looking back at ancient Roman sculpture. And we know from Vasari that his favorite Roman sculptor was Praxiteles. And there's 2 various examples here where you can see David's pose is derived from this. It's not an exact copy. Right? Now, Donatello's David is rather important historically because it's the first life-sized bronze nude since ancient Rome. That is something that Christian artists in the Middle Ages simply didn't do. Right? A, the nudes, right? But B, sculpture in general, and certainly life-size sculpture. Because if you make a life-size sculpture, you're doing what God did. You're forming stuff from the earth into a human being. You're not breathing life into it, but it's dangerous, isn't it? Because the second commandment tells Christians, you don't make carved images. So full-size statues, particularly full-size nudes, were something we really didn't see for 1,000 years prior to Donatello's David, right? So this truly is a Renaissance work. It's reviving not only ancient Roman body types, but it's also reviving the idea of the full-scale nude figure. It's simply not seen. Now we'll quit with this. The process here is what's called lost wax bronze casting. And the way that you make a bronze is you don't get a big piece of bronze and cut it, right? Whereas with a marble statue, you go get a nice piece of marble and you chip away the outside, right? What you do to make a bronze statue is you build up the form out of something else. Usually like a plaster matrix or maybe even a clay matrix. And then you cover it with a thin layer of wax. The sculpture that you made. You then cover the wax with another layer of plaster with pinholes to hold them together. You heat it up, and the wax disappears. The wax is lost. You then pour the bronze in where the wax used to be. Right? Crack away the outside. Shave off the pin marks. Finish the surface. Polish it. Treat it with chemicals so that the bronze can either look gold or with this wonderful brownish green patina. Is all the result of a chemical treatment, right? So it's a process that hadn't been used also in forever. You can use moss wax for all sorts of things. Doors, right? Boxes. Yeah. And it ends up with a hollow statue. And the whole point is that the statue is hollow at the end. And that's because if it were, it already weighs tons, but if it were solid bronze, it would be extraordinary, right? And extraordinarily expensive. Why waste all that metal? Like nobody's going to see it anyway. So, Donatello's David is reviving an old tradition from ancient Greece and Rome, lost wax bronze casting. It's reviving the idea of a full-scale nude figure for the first time in over 1,000 years, right? And it's reviving the body type. Not only the perfect proportions, but also that pose. All of that comes from ancient Roman art. Right? Now, we'll talk more about this, David. We're going to wrap up the 15th century on Tuesday and move into the High Renaissance, our well-known people like Michelangelo and Raphael. I'll be updating, and I hope, I've got lists of like on my little calendar, grade worksheets every day, and then all of a sudden the dean asks me to do something else and it gets bumped down. So this afternoon I have grade worksheets down there. We'll see if we can get to it today, right? Or something else is going to come up. But the worksheet for 16th century Italy will be the next one, and it will probably be due next week. So if you want to get started on it now, I'll update Canvas with the due date, and when I do, I'll tell you. Okay? It's worksheet 5. Okay? All right, I'll see you guys on Tuesday.